Welcome to our second session of the day. My name is Francesca Di Maria Moni. I am the Operations Manager at Away Home Canada. We co-facilitate and lead the youth stream, and we're very grateful that that is sponsored by the Home Depot Canada Foundation in keeping with their mission to prevent and end youth homelessness in Canada. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to do some housekeeping, and then we're going to get into our presentations. The 2024 National Conference on Ending Homelessness is being held on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. The peoples of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory since time immemorial. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We acknowledge and celebrate the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from coast to coast to coast who participate in this conference and lead the work to end homelessness across Turtle Island. Okay, so we do have simultaneous interpretation with Daniel and Annie in the back, so we're going to be grateful for that. And we have Miles and Hannah, our tech support, so if there are any mic issues or techie stuff, Hannah's going to help us in the back there.
Reviewed literature out there on interventions period for young people that are transitioning away from homelessness. Again, it's starting to get better, but still limited. And then the next thing, and this is becoming true in the adult sector, not just the youth sector, is that we're understanding that there is a need for supports beyond just like four walls and a roof, right? We really need to focus more on helping people thrive and achieve social and economic inclusion. So supports beyond housing. And that's the focus of the work that we do. Okay, so this is called, the study I'm going to talk about is called Transitioning Youth Out of Homelessness 2.0. So that means there was a 1.0. So just really briefly, and if you're interested, I've just did a screen grab of the papers that we published on this. But a couple of years ago, we wrapped up a study. It was a 2.5-year study, and we gave everybody rent subsidies for 2 years. And half of them were randomly assigned a mentor. But what we learned was that even if people weren't assigned a mentor, people started talking to us about these informal mentors in their lives, people that played this coach-like role. And those young people, both quantitatively and qualitatively, the data seemed to signal that they did better in terms of something called identity capital. So identity capital is using your sense of purpose, feeling in control, self-efficacy, and self-esteem. So we took those two ideas, coaching and identity capital, to design this next intervention. So just a little bit about the work we do, because I think it's really important. We do this very imperfectly, but we really do try to do good community engaged work, and lived expertise is woven in from the people that we hire on our team to our youth advisors. And we also have really great long-standing partnerships that's really important for us. So the study I'm going to be talking about took place in Hamilton, St. Catharines, and Toronto with our 4 amazing community partners, Covenant House, Raft, Stepstones, and Living Rock. Just a little bit about our inclusion criteria, which is really important, is our team tries to come alongside young people that are already housed in market rent housing and support them. So our goal is not to take somebody necessarily right out of homelessness, but somebody that's already left homelessness, and provide them some important wraparound supports to prevent homelessness from reoccurring. So what did we do? So we took 40 young people and we gave them all rent subsidies for 1 year. So that's really important to us, that everybody gets rent subsidies, to be clear on that. And then half of them were randomly assigned a coach and a co-designed leadership guide. And then we followed them quantitatively and qualitatively every 4 months for a year. The most important thing for us to look at, because it's a small study, is feasibility and acceptability, but we're also interested in social and economic inclusion outcomes that you can see there, including identity capital. And then we're just going to explore some things around coaching engagement, and you'll see our findings in a second around that. So what is coaching? So it's kind of coaching, like I'm sure you've all heard of coaching, is kind of the Wild West out there with coaching and how people define coaching. But we use solution-focused brief coaching. That comes from solution-focused brief counseling, if you're familiar with that. But basically, in the nutshell, if you compare, like, say, coaching to mentorship, which was our last study, if I asked you a question and I was your mentor, I would probably draw on my life experience to give you advice. If I was a coach, I wouldn't do that. If I was a coach and you asked me a question, I would repeat the question back to you and get you to come up with your own answers. So a little bit more of an internal locus of control with coaching. The young people, there was 10 youth assigned to each coach, and they met the idea was for them to meet every other week for a full year. And then everybody also got assigned a co-designed leadership guide. So what happened? So first of all, before I get into the findings, our community partners, when we talked about our study design, they wanted us to assess the mental health at baseline. And so we did that because they wanted to see if young people's mental health at baseline, if that would impact engagement with the intervention. And so you can see here that almost all of our young people struggled with what we call struggling internally. So meeting the criteria for an internalizing diagnosis. So, and in brackets there, I just have what drove the responses. So it was a lot of responses around anxiety and flashbacks. The second most prominent thing was externalizing diagnosis, so paying attention. And then you can see that we can see substance use and crime and violence, but it's much lower than the other two. And we'll get back to that at the end. Okay, so 3 things, remember, feasibility and acceptability. So how did we do? So we did okay with the feasibility of this intervention. Frankly, because we're offering rent subsidies, I think that's why young people come to us, maybe not necessarily because they want coaching. So we were able to enroll 40 young people. Everybody in the control group stayed right to the end. We lost 2 people in the intervention group, and that was because one young person learned of the Canada-Ontario housing benefit. So for those of you that are familiar with that, of course, you get rent subsidies for much longer. So, I don't blame them. So they wanted to go on that instead. And then the other young person, honestly, they probably weren't a good fit for the study at the beginning. We probably shouldn't have enrolled them. They had a lot of unmet mental health needs. And so we lost that young person as well. So at the end, we had 18 in the intervention group and 20 complete the control group. So that's our feasibility. So is it feasible? We think so. Is it acceptable? So let's look at coaching engagement and the number of sessions. So if you look here on the right, you can see 10, 11, 12 young people, so 60% engage 50% or more. And you can see there that actually 11 young people engaged 70% or more, and this is over a course of a year. But then on the other side, on the left, there's some young people who are like, no, this isn't for me. So it was like young people either really liked it or they didn't like it. So is it acceptable? Yes, for some young people though. Okay. So my pet peeve is when people put a complicated slide up with a bunch of numbers and say, I'm sorry, this is too hard to read and I'm going to go really fast. So I'm going to sort of do that a little bit because I want to respect my colleagues' time and not go into the weeds too much. But basically, walking you through this from left to right. So we got identity capital, and I already talked to you about the 4 domains of identity capital, and then education, employment, or training. It's important to note that we use something called an intention to treat analysis, which is the gold standard for a randomized control trial. What that means is, remember how I showed you all the young people that didn't actually engage in coaching? We actually have to include their data here. So perhaps not surprisingly, in a nutshell, we really didn't see a difference between the young people assigned to the intervention and the young people assigned to the control. So if you look there, you can see the intervention group mean scores, the control group mean scores, and just a quick glance, you can see the numbers don't change much, right? And so there really wasn't a significant difference between the young people that got coaching and the young people that did not, getting that intention, using an intention to treat analysis. This is our colleague Tyler Frederick's subjective housing security scale. There's the domains there as well. And just like the last slide I showed you, there really was no difference between the young people who got coaching and the young people who just got the rent subsidies. Okay, so there's that. So then we looked at correlation, and of course correlation doesn't equal causation, but we saw some interesting things here, especially around identity capital. So the first thing that I think is really interesting is that young people at baseline who reported like a higher level of feeling in control of their lives, they were less likely to engage with this intervention, which maybe makes sense, right? So if you feel like I ask you and you're like, yeah, I'm good, I'm in control of my life, maybe you're less likely to engage in coaching. So that's what we saw there. The other thing that we saw was there is a correlation, weak correlation, with coaching engagement and identity capital when you look at self-esteem, purpose in life, and locus of control, but a stronger or a moderate correlation when it comes to self-efficacy. And this lines up with what we saw qualitatively too. So in other words, the more I engage in coaching, the more my self-efficacy appears to go up. And then the final thing, remember I said our community partners were curious about mental health at baseline? Even though almost all of our young people struggled with anxiety and many of them had trouble paying attention, there was no correlation between that and the ability to engage in coaching. So that's important to keep in mind. So now for I think the more interesting qualitative stuff, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rowan.
Thanks, Naomi. Great. So yeah, I'm going to take us into the qualitative findings. Before we dive in, I'll just give the caveat. These are based off of focus groups, and generally the youth who came to focus groups tended, unsurprisingly, to be the same youth who were engaging more highly in coaching. So our qualitative analysis is not necessarily representative of all the youth in the intervention group, but it is a window into what the experience was like for youth who engaged in coaching more consistently. So this is our overall thematic framework. Naomi really encouraged us to work in metaphors and think of symbols that helped us to understand what we were hearing. So when we heard about youth coming into this study and telling us about feeling stuck, feeling like they were repeating the same patterns over and over again and not feeling like anything would change, we got this mental image of sort of circling a roundabout. And we called that the state of inertia. And we kind of spun this out and realized that our other themes could also be worked into this metaphor. So we see supportive coaching here, sort of interrupting that circling and helping youth to recalibrate their sense of direction. So I'm going to go through our big 3 themes in more detail, provide quotes for each. Our team has also made a short animated video that summarizes these findings using the car metaphor as well. So I'm going to provide just a still image for each of the themes as well from that video. So starting with the state of inertia, we heard over and over again from youth that they were coming into the study juggling a lot of competing priorities. So usually some combination of work, school, and family responsibilities. We also talked about this as role strain or role conflict, where youth really wanted to be working on bettering themselves, and also we're juggling a lot of other stuff at the same time that made that hard. So here we heard from a youth who was working on getting into a college course at the same time as working a summer job. And for them, at the end of the day, it was hard to even get half an hour to work on this intervention. I think the quote, "I just want to pass right out face first," is a feeling we have all had at the end of the day at some point. And thinking about that as the baseline, that then that's the stage that youth are trying to engage in coaching or work on self-directed leadership guide is a hard place to be coming from. So when we put this into the animation, we can see there's a lot going on in this car. There's a lot of stuff. There's alerts going off. We probably don't know what those mean or what to do about them. When we look outside the car, we also see that this youth was not set up for success. So the rainy weather symbolizes the structural and systemic barriers youth are navigating, predominantly high housing costs and low income. And then we also have this fog. A lot of youth talked to us about how it was really hard to imagine the future or imagine that anything would change in their lives. And some had stopped kind of setting goals for themselves at all. And we also see in the background this very confusing road sign. This came to us from the driving nightmares of our colleague Marty, and was used to represent some of youth's experiences trying to access services in the homelessness sector. So youth would, reach out and try and access supports, and not infrequently met with supports that they experienced as isolating, unhelpful, or confusing, which resulted in something our team called rational mistrust. So youth came into our study pretty skeptical about the intervention, and reasonably so based off of a lot of previous experiences where supports didn't actually help them. So for youth who did engage in the coaching intervention, our coaches were able to build a trusting relationship. We heard from a lot of youth how important it was that they felt like the coaches were genuinely invested in them and their lives. In this quote, we heard from a youth comparing coaching with their experiences of therapy. So they felt like their coach was more willing than a therapist to really like sit in their problems with them. They felt like a therapist kind of get paid to sit there and listen, and kind of felt like they were then sent back out into the world on their own. Whereas they felt like the coach was more willing to collaborate with them and really try and figure out different things that specifically worked for them. So despite the fact that our coaches were obviously also paid to sit there and listen to youth, youth did experience that as really a sensation that this coach was sort of in their corner and on their team. So when we put this in the video, we put the coach right in the car with the youth. They're there with their manual, with their toolkit. So their role is kind of to help youth figure out like what's happening, make sense of their experiences, and then figure out like what within this situation is in my control to change or improve or fix. We can also see that there's a map and the fog has lifted. Youth describe their coaching conversations as more often looking to the future as opposed to the past, which really helped youth to actually imagine the future. And we can also see that the rain has stopped. So while youth were in this study, as Naomi said, they had rent subsidies, so we alleviated some of the structural barriers that youth are navigating. Recalibrating is our last theme, where we talk about the transformations that were possible for some youth through this intervention. This quote, I think, is one of the most impactful that we got from this study. We have a youth here coming to the end of the coaching intervention talking about how before they had been very quiet, felt like they didn't speak up for themselves, felt like kind of a pushover. But now coming to the end of it, they had a home, they had a partner they really cared about. They felt like through having a coach and doing therapy that together this really helped them see, I'm much more than just a shell of a person. And that's how they had felt before, that they just kind of lived to help other people. But through this intervention, they felt like they were helping themselves and felt like they were just more of a person who had a life, who had opportunities, and who could make a difference in someone else's life. We had youth in general talk about changes in mindset and perspective as really, really important in this intervention. And we had a few youth echo this similar narrative of kind of moving from feeling like they were living for other people to feeling like they were living for themselves, which was pretty honestly wild and impactful to hear about. So when we go back into the video, there's still a lot in this car, but it's a little more organized. We see that this youth has their fog lights on so they can actually continue to see ahead into the future and look at different possibilities. Outside, we can see the weather does still suck. Our study did not target or change those structural and systemic barriers. Those are still there. We did hear from youth that when they encountered stressful and challenging situations, they did feel like they had a few more tools and options about how they showed up in those situations. So again, the fog lights, we've got windshield wipers going on now. And the last thing I want to highlight in here is these flowers on the dash. So these were to represent self-compassion, which is something that we weren't really expecting to hear about, but youth told us was really key in underpinning a lot of any of the changes that were able to happen for them through this intervention. That just like being gentler to themselves was actually really key in any of the other shifts that were happening. So as we reach the end, I'll just highlight some of the main things we learned that we hope you take away today and what our next steps in our research are. So again, as Naomi had summarized, while we didn't see statistically significant differences between our intervention and control groups, when we actually looked by how much youth engaged in the coaching intervention, there is a promising correlation between how much youth attended the coaching sessions and their improvements in identity capital, specifically self-efficacy. Our coaches didn't deliver like a pure coaching method. We did notice that they incorporated some aspects of mentorship, like a really encouraging relationship, sometimes giving advice. And we also want to note that the kind of consistent, intentional care our coaches were able to practice did rely on them having low caseloads. And as Naomi mentioned as well, someone's ability to engage in the coaching was not impacted by their baseline mood or mental health as we measured it. So while we are still figuring out who this is the best fit for, that doesn't seem to be a piece of the puzzle. And our next steps, we're kind of taking what we've learned about rent subsidies, coaching and mentorship, and leadership programming, and moving into a 5-year study that will also include job placements. So you can see we're going to continue working on economic capital and identity capital, and we're also going to figure out ways of more specifically targeting social capital as well. So natural supports, community building, and relationship skills. Thank you, of course, to our funders for making this possible. Please reach out to us with questions, ask us questions right now, and if you'd like to watch the full animation that we referenced here, the QR code will take you there as well. Thank you.
And you stayed within your time. I'm so pleased. So we can open up for questions. Again, a reminder, if you can come to the microphone, you can wave your hand and I can point you over there if you like, or you can just make your way up if you have questions. Cheyenne.
Hi, folks. That was really great hearing about your study and the outcomes, and also the next steps in terms of other things you're going to be exploring. My question is, in terms of your sample group, both the controlled group and the non-controlled group, what was the disaggregated data looking like in terms of race, ethnicity, age group, et cetera?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So that's like in our extra slides. When we were practicing, we were like, oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry. You told me that at the beginning and I didn't. Thanks for the question. That was one of the extra slides that we took out so that we could stay within our 20 minutes. Rowan, jump in if I'm forgetting, but age was a nice, like there was about a third that were like 18 to 20. And so we did like, young people were like 18 to 24. And so it was like a nice mix of like thirds around. So that was good. Overrepresentation, not surprisingly, of racialized young people. We had 12% of our young people were Indigenous, and the rest didn't identify that way. About 25% identified as trans, and what else do we have? 37, Rowan's like, you're looking at me. 37% identified, like, in terms of sexual orientation, as not being heterosexual. Anything else I'm forgetting? Should I say that?
I think that's the highlight. And there weren't differences between the two groups
Yeah.
in terms of control and intervention.
Yeah. Does that help?
I don't have, do I have a wireless?
This is wireless.
Oh, I guess you can move it around.
Yeah, I think what would be really interesting as well is to also ask, because I mean, let me rewind it a little bit. When we think about the definition of youth bring of people, it's changed, right? There are many organizations and even government looking at people into like we're 30, 31, 32, who are now being included into the youth space with youth definition. So I think it would be really interesting to see what the older section of now included youth would also think about these things and how they would respond to these things, especially because they transitioned outside of the traditional youth landscape. Because their transition is always forgotten as well, and they probably need much more supports as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that comment. That's a really important comment. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm from Calgary at a nonprofit that runs all kinds of similar-ish programming. Can you talk about the difference between case management, coaching, and therapy?
We spent so much time talking about this we met for a year every other week doing like qualitative. And anyway, we talked a lot about this because I'm a nurse practitioner and I work in a shelter. So like we were like pulling this apart. Do you want to start or do you want me to start and you jump in?
Sure, I can try and start. Definitely some of the differences with therapy and coaching, because youth would often compare them in our interviews. So especially the solutions-focused coaching is really like, where are you right now? Where are you looking to go in the next while? What practical things can we do? Youth talked about their experiences of therapy often being less practical and more like digging into the past, like let's talk about your trauma and like how you got here. Very important, not necessarily as like changing the way you're day-to-day moving through the world. So that was one of the differences there. And I would say for coaching and case management, Our coaches were not doing a lot of like system navigation around like referrals, making sure people got to their appointments, that kind of like classic case management stuff.
No, I think that's really good. And of course, we describe it as being like this, and we met with the coaches on a regular basis. And so sometimes like young people were a little bit confused too, like they would just, and rightly so, right? Like they're like, can you help me? I don't know, drive me to the doctor. I'm just making that up. But like something like that. And the coach would be like, no, actually, that's not the role that I have, but let me connect you with somebody that does. So if that helps a little bit. But yeah, the coaches wouldn't do things like that.
Yeah, super
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hi there. I'm not sure if you guys had mentioned this actually to throughout the presentation, or I may have missed it. But when you were speaking about the coaching aspect, I know you said there was equal parts of youth that benefited from the coaching versus those that didn't find any, like, am I correct in saying that? Right? They didn't see any like impact from it.
So
So-
there was no difference between, like, if you want to look at our social and economic inclusion outcomes, which we use education, employment, and training, identity capital, and subjective housing stability, there was no difference between the group that got coaching and the group that did not.
Got you. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, but then those that received the coaching, so I think I may have misinterpreted that. They all found some kind of benefit from the coaching aspect itself, correct?
Well, we have to be careful how we talk about
Yeah.
that because it's a small sample size. But so we did the correlation work. So there is a correlation, a weak to moderate correlation, moderate for self-efficacy, that the more you engage in coaching, the more something like your self-efficacy will go up.
Okay.
And that
understood.
actually aligns nicely with what we saw qualitatively as well.
Got you. Okay.
Does that
Because
help?
I
Yeah.
guess like my question was going to be those individuals that you felt were impacted the most or saw the most progression through the coaching. Did any of them portray any similar characteristics or personality traits that made them feel like they were aligned more with the coaching they received versus those that I guess did not feel it was as impactful?
Yeah, I think just looking by like not necessarily how much coaching impacted someone, but how much they just like showed up to coaching, because there was, as you said, quite a difference. I think some of the things that Naomi mentioned, like internal locus of control. So if you've actually kind of already felt like I'm in control of what's going on, I got this, they were less likely to do coaching, which kind of makes sense. I think we also saw that men and boys were less likely to engage in coaching when offered than not. And that's something we're curious about, like, what else can we do to make this feel like a better fit? There seems to be a connection missing there. I think those are the only variables we looked at sort of quantitatively.
For sure. Thank you,
Yeah.
guys.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm a harm reduction worker from Kitchener-Waterloo region, and I was wondering if you have any other exclusion criteria, such as like substance use or anything.
The short answer is no. Yeah, we try to make this as low barrier as possible. So no.
Another question I have is that there wasn't really a significant difference between the control group and the group that you're providing coaching with.
Yeah.
So do you still suggest that coaching is an effective intervention for youth who are experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, it's a really great question, an important question, and one we've talked about a lot as a group. I think we as a team still really believe in coaching. When I said to my frontline colleagues, like, oh, I'm disappointed because only like 55% of our young people went to coaching 75% or more of the time. And they're like, wait, Naomi, you got a study where young people mostly probably came for the rent subsidies, and you got like 55% of them to go like every other week for an entire year to coaching. Like, that's pretty good. So I think that there is some promise around coaching, but I think what we have to figure out is like for who, like who's the best fit for coaching. So we're still kind of figuring that out. I don't know, anything else? Yeah. It's a good
Thank you very
question.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think we'll just do these last two questions and then.
Okay.
Okay.
That was kind of my question was, how did you go about choosing who was the coaches?
Yeah.
Like, who did the coaching?
Do you want me to do it? Okay. So we partnered with the Canadian Centre for Brief Coaching. They're affiliated with the University of Toronto and Harvard University, such a really experienced coach. And she recommended one of her former students would be a good coach on our study. So there was that one. And then we did we posted the job and then we interviewed them. We also interviewed him, and our youth advisors helped do the interviews. That's really important as well. So lived experts help pick them as well. So quite a few people applied, and then these are the two that we ended up with.
I would just add that these were folks who had like private coaching practices
Yeah.
already. So they were not folks who were sort of like working as service providers within the homelessness sector already, but were doing sort of private practice coaching already with youth.
So you guys only had 2 coaches for 8 youth or 11 youth?
For 20 youth.
For
So they
20
each had a caseload of 10. And what Rowan said is really important too. Young people said to us, they actually liked it that the coaches had nothing to do with the homelessness sector. I mean, I work in the sector. I know and love people in the sector, but young people they were like, oh, I kind of like that they're not reporting back to the sector. That was interesting.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
And she answered my question.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi and Rowan. That was amazing. As we'll give them a round of applause. And Hannah, you're going to help me. And we're going to bring up Linda.
Okay, thank you for coming, everyone. Like Francesca mentioned, my name is Minda, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a study we recently published called I Want Purpose in My Life, a qualitative exploration of how youth experiencing homelessness envision their futures. So just to give you a little bit of background information on this research, preparing for the future is a major component of development during adolescence and early adulthood. And during this time, youth are typically participating in a variety of experiences and formal and informal settings that lay the foundation for the development of their future expectations. Research has found that having these future expectations and goals can lead to positive psychosocial outcomes and buffer against negative ones. But for the population of youth experiencing homelessness, development, and in turn, the development of future expectations is often challenged by things like economic instability, housing insecurity, limited social support, and limited opportunities for education and employment, to name just a few of the many barriers that youth experiencing homelessness face. So, in light of these challenges, research suggests that youth experiencing homelessness require significant additional support beyond the provision of stable housing to manage the physical, social, cognitive, and emotional changes that are associated with transitioning into adulthood, realizing their future expectations, and ultimately making sustainable exits from homelessness. So the data for this research comes from a mixed methods longitudinal randomized control trial of Housing First for Youth that was conducted by Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, which is based out of York University and co-led by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and Away Home Canada. And Housing First for Youth is a program that provides youth with access to safe, affordable, and permanent housing with no preconditions and individualized supports. And it's rooted in the belief that youth are better able to move forward with their lives if they're first housed. Sorry, I'm not able to scroll in my notes on this. I just don't have a pointer. It's okay if not. Oh. Okay, it's okay. It's not letting me click. It's okay, I'll continue. Sorry about that. Anyways, so the youth for this study were recruited from the community, the community of those accessing the youth homelessness services. So there were 2 demonstration sites. They were in Ottawa and Toronto. The youth in Ottawa were ages 18 to 24, and there were youth who were currently experiencing homelessness. So that included living in a shelter, sleeping rough, couch surfing. Whereas the youth in Toronto were youth ages 17 to 24 who were transitioning out of the provincial child welfare system. So basically, just to briefly distinguish between Housing First and Treatment as Usual, the participants who were randomized to Housing First for Youth received housing and supports in accordance with the Housing First for Youth model, which included a housing subsidy for the 4-year duration of this study, as well as a caseworker who provides specialized supports based on their needs. And those who were receiving Treatment as Usual continued to navigate the homelessness system and sector as they were before, meaning they had access to anything that was available in the community for youth experiencing homelessness. So that could be things like income support, drop-ins, mental health and health clinics, potentially transitional housing or longer-term housing initiatives. So in addition to collecting a wide range of quantitative data, they also collected a subset they also collected qualitative data from a subset of youth who were participating in the RCT. And so there were multiple qualitative interviews, and the objective of these interviews were to understand how young people's lives have changed and their life story, and what things may have contributed to those changes. So they assessed outcomes like housing history and stability, health and well-being, access to income and education, and social inclusion, and other outcomes as well. The interview protocols were split into 3 sections. So there was questions covering their past life and pathways into homelessness, their current life, and visions for the future. So getting back to our study, we used data from this RCT to answer 2 main research questions. One, we wanted to understand how youth experiencing homelessness envision their futures. And 2, we wanted to understand whether visions of the future were different for those receiving Housing First for Youth versus those receiving Treatment as Usual. So like I mentioned just a minute ago, there were a total of 148 youth who participated in the RCT, but the sample for our study is comprised of the 38 youth from Ottawa and Toronto who agreed to participate in a qualitative baseline interview. So 18 of those youth were receiving Housing First for Youth, and 20 were receiving Treatment as Usual. The interviews were semi-structured and narrative, and we focused our analysis specifically on data from the 3rd section of the interview, which covered questions about their future life. So just to give a brief demographic breakdown of the 38 participants who were participating in our study, the sample was approximately 40% cis female and 45% cis male, 3% trans women, 11% trans men, and 3% non-binary individuals. Around 55 identified as heterosexual, with the remaining 45% of the sample identifying as a member of the 2S LGBTQ+ community. And 34% of the sample identified as white, 8% identified as Indigenous, 26% identified as Black, and a remaining 32% identified as a person of color or a person of mixed race. So in terms of our analysis, the interviews were transcribed verbatim, and we analyzed the transcripts following a thematic abductive approach. Before we started coding, we blinded all the interviews so that we didn't know whether participants were receiving Housing First for Youth or Treatment as Usual, just so that didn't bias our interpretations of the data. The data was coded in multiple cycles with multiple coders using in vivo. And then after coding, the interviews were unblinded and the coded data was summarized and analyzed into a cross-case matrix, which we created in Excel to look at themes across and within each participant's interview. So the 4 main themes that we identified were visions of the future, ideal housing, future relationships and social support, and barriers to goal achievement. So I'll expand on each of those in the following slides and provide some quotes to illustrate the themes. So overall, we found that visions of the future were generally positive for youth across both conditions, and they had similar aspirations in the areas that you might expect, like work, education, relationships, and housing. However, there were differences between those receiving Housing First for Youth and Treatment as Usual when it came to goal setting and planning. Specifically, those receiving Housing First for Youth had clear expectations for the future and had concrete short-term and long-term plans for how to achieve those. Whereas those who are unstably housed or receiving Treatment as Usual seem to have difficulty envisioning the long-term future and making plans and goal setting due to uncertainties about their immediate future. So a couple quotes here just to illustrate this theme. A participant receiving Housing First for Youth said, "I view my future as very bright. I have a lot of ambitions, a lot of dreams, a lot of goals that I want to achieve, and I'm not settling for less." And then they would go on to describe the details of those plans and goals and how the steps they're going to take to get there. Whereas a participant receiving Treatment as Usual said, "The toughest thing is just the fear of the unknown, like where you're going to be in like a couple days or even a month down the road." So this seemed to indicate to us that youth receiving Treatment as Usual or who are unstably housed lacked the ability or the opportunity to envision the long-term future due to a preoccupation on having their basic needs met and overcoming daily stressors. So the next theme we identified in our analysis was future housing in terms of what would be ideal for youth in the future. So although some of the Housing First for Youth participants did have detailed and specific housing ideals, most of them focused on abstract qualities of what makes a good home. The Treatment as Usual participants also focused on describing these abstract qualities of home, but their ideals were more variable and again reflected this uncertainty and instability about the future, with some noting that they hadn't given it any thought yet. So a participant receiving Housing First for Youth said, "I want to be able to feel safe and comfortable in my home environment. That's a big one. And I guess I want to feel like I belong where I am." Whereas a participant receiving Treatment as Usual said, "Honestly, I haven't really thought about it because all I ever knew was unstable housing. That's just kind of like the norm to me." So this suggested to us that stable housing seems to be necessary in order for youth to begin to think about and plan for their futures. So the next theme that we identified were discussions of future relationship and social support. And interestingly enough, this varied across not only conditions, but also across demonstration sites, so the cities, Ottawa and Toronto. So in Ottawa, the discussions of future relationships and social support from those receiving Housing First for Youth were that they prioritized establishing healthy relationships in the transition out of homelessness, either by repairing broken ones that had been damaged in the past or by forming new ones, compared to Treatment as Usual participants in Ottawa who emphasized self-reliance and autonomy, which there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, just kind of reflects a difference in perspective. Interestingly enough, though, youth in Toronto focus much less on future relationships and social support than youth from Ottawa, with most of them not discussing it at all, or if they did, it was in the context of needing to find a trusted adult or a mentor to help them navigate life decisions and practical matters. So a couple quotes again. A participant receiving Housing First for Youth said, "I would like to grow my relationships again. I've kicked a lot of people out and I need to fix that and rebuild some of those relationships that I've kind of abandoned." Whereas a participant receiving Treatment as Usual said, "You can have these people, like a worker, for example, to support you. But when it comes to yourself and your physical being, at the end of the day, you're there by yourself. It's you and you only." Finally, I want to discuss a couple barriers to goal achievement that we identified during the analysis. So first, and somewhat unsurprisingly, youth receiving Treatment as Usual or who are unstably housed indicated that housing instability significantly impacted their ability to think about and plan for the future. So for example, a participant receiving treatment as usual said, I think the whole issue is if I had a steady place to live, like my own apartment, getting through school and then college and then planning for the future would be so much more achievable. The second barrier to goal achievement that we identified, and again, somewhat unsurprising, is a lack of income or money and how this stands in the way of being able to move forward with their futures. So for example, again, a participant receiving treatment as usual said, to be honest, like just money. That's the only thing I'm struggling with at this time in my life because I don't have a career yet or anything or like a solid income that's enough for housing and stuff now. Like without money, it makes shit really hard. Sorry if I'm not allowed to swear. But I want to highlight that despite these barriers and the presence of these barriers, youth demonstrated a sense of hope and resilience in the telling of their life stories and made it clear that they understand like the steps they need to take to move forward with their future and that there's a need for budgeting and saving in order to do that. So especially those receiving Housing First for Youth seem to indicate that they noted that money and income are crucial for their future success, with one saying, this summer I have to get a job no matter what. I want to get a job and I actually want to keep it for a long time so that I can save some money for the future. So it's clear that given the extensive challenges that youth experiencing homelessness face, interventions need to support youth in planning for their futures, achieving their goals, and ultimately exiting homelessness. And the findings from this study really emphasize the role of safe, affordable, and permanent housing in doing so. Like I've mentioned, youth in the study who were stably housed had clear short and long-term goals and knew the practical steps that they had to take to achieve these, whereas those who were unstably housed or receiving treatment as usual, they had less concrete visions for the future due to a preoccupation with their immediate future. The next important thing to highlight from this study is the need for early intervention in that critical period for youth experiencing homelessness. Research shows that adults experiencing homelessness tend to have less hopeful expectations of the future due to things like chronic homelessness. But for youth experiencing homelessness, there is this sense of hope, but it's important to just emphasize the early delivery of intervention because research also shows, there's a study by Sean Kidd and his colleagues that shows that this hope about the future that youth tend to have declines rapidly over time, with youth reporting that just after just a year of experiencing homelessness, their hope has declined significantly. And alongside that, we also need to highlight the importance of the timely delivery of supports beyond just the provision of stable housing. Again, to help youth manage the developmental changes associated with this stage of life, as well as navigating the transition out of homelessness. I also want to highlight the importance of building community and lasting connections for youth experiencing homelessness. While professional supports are transformative for many youth, it's also important to focus on rebuilding natural supports and family networks and community networks. And this research has shown that this can have many positive benefits for youth, including increased mental health recovery, increased psychological integration in the community, higher rates of self-esteem, among other outcomes. And finally, I just wanted to touch on this again, even though I just spoke about this, just the need for financial supports for youth who are transitioning out of homelessness. Obviously, a lack of income and money is a huge barrier for these youth. And with the rising cost of living and housing in today's economy, it's really important that interventions and services, as well as programs such as employment readiness programs, resume help, job search assistance, that kind of thing, are provided alongside the delivery of stable housing intervention. So that's everything I have for you today. I just wanted to say thank you to MTS making the shift for conducting this RCT, and a thank you to all my co-authors for working on this project with me.
And thank you to the co-authors as well. I know I've got a number of you in the room, so that's great. Questions? Again, you have to go up to the mic, so off you go.
I'll hold this. Hi, Cheyenne again.
Hi.
I'm very curious because when you have the two populations that you're working with, right? So the treatment as usual versus housing first for youth. In terms of the supports that the treatment as usual folks were receiving versus housing first for youth folks were receiving, because obviously for housing first, there's services connected to that model, and I'm wondering how they differed from the two, how they differed between the two population groups, and also wondering if questions were asked in terms of trust-based relationships and how that impacted the way that they were able to envision the future. And when I'm talking about trust-based relationships, I'm talking about the service providers that they were working with as well, and how that impacted their navigation.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there were questions about their social support and including service providers and like other more natural supports, so like family and that kind of thing. And so we did kind of get to look at, this was only the baseline data, so there were interviews after this one, but we did kind of get to look at just the difference between those receiving Housing First for Youth and how they see their social support networks versus those receiving treatment as usual and how they see their social support networks. So yeah, I don't know if that answers that question. I can't like say about correlation given that it was qualitative, but sorry.
Restate the question.
Oh, sorry. They want you to speak into the microphone for the recording.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, she basically just asked if there were a difference in terms of how those receiving Housing First for Youth and treatments as usual envision their futures based on their relationships with people, right? Is that essentially? So yeah, there were some differences. Again, this was kind of the interesting theme where we saw more differences across demonstration sites, than across conditions, because the Ottawa Housing First and Treatment as Usual both did talk about social support, with the ones receiving Housing First for Youth talking about how they really valued relationships. And even though a lot of those relationships had become damaged over the course of experiencing homelessness, they either wanted to repair those. So a lot of people talked in that context about repairing relationships with family. They either wanted to repair those, or once they left homelessness, form new relationships with other people that could, like, people talked a lot about like a partner to share their life with, or friends to live with, that kind of thing, that were separate from their like homelessness network. And then the Treatment as Usual in Ottawa, they tended to, although they did still, a lot of them mentioned if there were still like important people in their life, like a lot of them had partners or whatever and would mention their partner, but it was kind of a different perspective at where they were like, yeah, I have this person and I can rely on them for emotional support if I need them. But like the quote I read, at the end of the day, it's you and only you. So really, I do try to rely on myself, and these people are a bonus kind of thing, instead of where Housing First for Youth people were really like, I need these relationships are integral to transitioning out of homelessness. And then interestingly, like I was saying, in Toronto, the participants both receiving Treatment as Usual and Housing First for Youth at least at the baseline point, didn't really discuss social support and future relationships. They were asked the question, but they'd be like, yeah, like there just wasn't kind of as much to say there. The only time it did come up was people in talking in the context of, well, I need to get my citizenship, so I'd like a worker. Like it was like very, like I said, practical kind of focus. Like I need someone to help me navigate this life decision. And there didn't really seem to be a difference in Toronto between the Housing First for Youth and the treatment as usual. Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering, as it was a longitudinal study, if along the way there were any impacts from like high turnover rates with the case management workers and the youth that were.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. For our study, the one that I was presenting on, we were only looking at the baseline qualitative data, but it was a longitudinal qualitative study. And from what I know from the other data, yes, there was attrition and that participants were lost along the way for various reasons. And I'm actually not sure about case management, like losing. Okay, yes. So I've got some head nods. So yes, there was also some attrition with case managers and stuff like that. But yeah, our study was actually like a cross-sectional look at the baseline data.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Hey, so my question goes a little bit off the idea that many of them were talking more about concretizing their plans, having better sense of the goals and the plans necessary to achieve those goals. Is there going to be any follow-up to see if the attempts were made to actually actualize those goals and to get success rates?
Yeah,
and then
so
part two, just a little bit off the idea of rational mistrust that the first group brought up, of whether those goals involve system supports versus more personal or non-system supports too, whether they have an increase in their willingness to engage with the system after achieving housing first.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So our plan is to look at this from a longitudinal perspective as well. We kind of did this first study in chunks where we looked at like the Ottawa Housing First for Youth and Treatment as Usual group at baseline, then the Toronto Housing First for Youth and Treatment as Usual group at baseline, and then across all conditions and demonstration sites at baseline. So our plan is eventually to do kind of like a longitudinal follow-up to this study where we see if their plans for the future and all these expectations and goals they talked about that this first time point pan out. And so yeah, more to come on that. And sorry, your second question, I forget it. Like over time or, sorry.
I remember to get back up to the mic again.
Very good.
Was just if there was any, I really liked the phrasing of rational mistrust that the first group brought out. And I'm curious if there's any attempt or any interest in tracking whether those plans and the attempts to achieve those plans involved any shift in how willing they were to engage with system supports, whether youth who had expressed a rational mistrust saw that shift over time after achieving housing first versus not.
That's a really great question. I don't know if we've actually explicitly discussed a plan to look at that, but my dissertation is also using this data, and I'm looking at, I'm doing a longitudinal qualitative analysis of social support and how the role it plays in youth transitions out of homelessness in terms of like support from service providers, families, significant others, friends, kind of their whole social network, and there's many more have come up. So might have a better answer for you at a later time, but it would definitely be interesting to kind of look at that rational mistrust piece. Thank you for that comment.
Any other questions? Great, well, thank you, Minda. And I guess, yeah, we're going to have Amanda Buckney come and join us now. And I don't know how to do this.
That's okay.
Okay. I can find. Oh, the pointer doesn't work. I see. Yeah, I might need some assistance getting this screen down with no pointer.
Is this just for your notes?
Just need to click out of this and then put it. Yeah, that's my notes.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you for sticking with things in the part of the afternoon that usually I have a slump in energy. So hopefully we can keep the energy up for the rest of this session here. My name is Amanda Bucknia. My pronouns are she and her. I'm excited to be speaking with you all today. I'm going to be sharing the very, very preliminary data from my doctoral dissertation. I'm still in data collection mode, and you're the first audience to get a sneak peek at this data. So I'm going to be talking about this project that I'm doing called More Than a Checkbox: Youth Engagement and Prioritization in Community Homelessness Planning. And I'm specifically looking at Ontario, and I'll explain a bit about that. But what we're going to cover today is I'm going to share about the project's background, a bit of an overview, and then to give us some context, talk about community homelessness planning in Canada, what it looks like, what we're working with in the context here, and then some preliminary findings from a survey that I did on it's on engagement and prioritization more broadly, but looking at the youth data specifically. And then we're gonna have some Q&A time, and definitely you're probably gonna have more questions than I have answers to at this point. But what I'm really excited to do is to get you in thinking through this with me so that I can take these questions back as I'm doing more data analysis and as I move into the next part of the project. So I'm gonna start by talking about what this project is and how it started. So I've been working in this space of youth homelessness prevention, advocacy, and specifically research since I started with Away Home Canada back in 2016. And I was also working with Canadian Observatory on Homelessness at the time. Really thinking through what got me interested in this space. I didn't come with lived experience of youth homelessness, but I was really empowered or inspired around the idea of driving policy and systems change to support youth and their families, their natural supports and communities to prevent homelessness. And I was particularly curious about how can we wrap our heads around youth homelessness as this fusion policy issue that cuts across so many different systems and sectors and challenges, and how its solutions don't necessarily neatly fit into the box of housing or education or any particular box for that matter. And in the early days when I was working with Away Home, we started this thing called the Systems Planning Collective, which was initially an attempt to try to bring our organizations together with Help Seeker, who you may be familiar with, because we're all doing work supporting communities on planning. Away Home Canada was making youth homelessness plans. The Canadian Observatory on Homelessness was sometimes contracted to work on plans, and so was Help Seeker, Dr. Alina Turner. But we hadn't really pooled our thoughts and resources on how do we support communities to do this work? There's no consistent practice here. And during that time, I was fortunate to be able to work with a few communities on their homelessness strategies. But what I walked away with was there was a lot more questions than answers for me about how do we do this well? There's so much energy and ingenuity, creativity, passion, and drive within these communities. And yet frequently these plans, they get made, they're launched, and then it's not clear always to the community or from people from the outside of the people that are holding the plans how they actually make an impact. How do you move into implementation? And so I've been working to develop some research questions based on this experience that I had, and then also through conversations with many of the folks in this room and across Canada to think about what is the state of prioritization and participation of young people specifically within Ontario community homelessness planning. Of course, I'm not just interested in Ontario. This is a starting place as a doctoral project, but I'm really interested in going across the country to dig into this more. But more specifically, the things that I'm sitting with as questions are things like, why do we do community homelessness planning? Initially, I was thinking, well, I'd really like to write a dissertation on how to do good youth homelessness community planning. But there is so little research on this space in general, I needed to take a step back. And so this research is really starting with these questions of why do we do planning? How do we do planning? What are the practices that we're using to engage people, specifically people with lived experience? What is the depth of engagement? And then more specifically, who does this work benefit and who maybe doesn't it benefit? And so these are some of the questions that I'm sitting with and that we'll think through together. Where I'm at with the project right now is in the preliminary data collection. So I've done a national survey on with folks that are in different planning spaces across the country. And then I'm looking specifically at the Ontario data with 31 respondents from Ontario, primarily who are in, I'm not sure if you're familiar with how Ontario works with homelessness like funding, but it's divvied up into these 47 different regions that are kind of map onto municipalities. They're called service managers. They're not exactly municipalities either, but they all have been mandated to create 10-year plans to end homelessness. So I'm starting with these 47 communities. We had over 20 communities represented in the survey from those 31 respondents, which is pretty good. I'm really pleased with the spread of the data as well. So, but what I'm going to kind of start before I get into that data is to talk a bit more about the space of community homelessness planning itself in Canada. And starting with a bit, I'm going ahead too far. Starting with a timeline of what this has looked like. So one of the questions I had was about when did this even start? The earliest we find plans around homelessness in Canada is around 1999, when the federal government started to give funding directly to communities to address homelessness. But it wasn't until 2008 that we had our first 10-year plan come on the scene in Calgary, Alberta. And this was what we call policy drift. In the United States, they had been doing 10-year plans for quite some time, almost actually a little over a decade at that point. And they had over 300 communities, or around 300 communities, develop 10-year plans. And so we started looking to the States to go, maybe this is a good idea to get ourselves organized and thinking about how do we actually address this problem more meaningfully and not just manage it. And at the same time that 10-year plans started to come on the scene in Canada, we also adopted Housing First. And then in Ontario specifically, in 2011, we saw the mandate come from the province that all of these 47 different service managers have to make 10-year plans. They have to update them every 5 years. And so by 2014, the first 10-year plans had been released in Ontario. And between now and 10 years later, where we are today, now we're at the end of these cycles of 10-year plans. And there's been a lot that's happened in between those two points in time. So what I'm sitting with is, what have we learned from this? 10-year plans have continued to be made, yet now we have a national housing strategy. The landscape is very different. We had COVID-19. Have we taken a second to reflect on what we've been learning from this process? My guess is, based on the research and how little there is, that maybe we haven't actually spent a lot of time thinking through it. And yet we're still practicing community homelessness planning. So what this leads me to is thinking through some questions that I had in this survey to kind of get a landscape of, like, what are people's impressions, specifically these people that are responsible for their local plans, around the funding they get versus the influence. I want to understand, how are they making priorities? Who are they listening to? What are all the voices that are in these communities that are trying to assert themselves? And then how influential are they perceived to be? Not to go super in depth into all of this, just to say that I asked them about what their perceptions were of the funding they get from government. Of course, there's all this other funding that comes from different parts of philanthropy, private sector. But from the government side of things, unsurprisingly, maybe in Ontario, the province was typically the largest, or the majority of the funding that they get, followed by municipal funding, though there was quite a bit of variation there, and federal funding was the least amount of money. And yet we also know that federal funding, it's, according to these folks, the least influential on planning, which makes sense, tracks with how much they're getting. But what's the most influential in communities, according to these folks, was the by name list and coordinated access data, as well as their service provider consultations. But also something that was noted was that lived expert consultation was rated really highly in how they thought about their priorities, as well as this documented research on homelessness, whether that's kind of nationally or in their community. So just all of this to say, there's a lot of different inputs, things that are influencing people's priorities. And so this leads to the question, like, where do youth fit within all of this? So I'm going to share a few of the preliminary findings from Ontario here. So youth as a planning priority. The questions that I asked here were whether or not and how young people are considered to be a priority within their community. Of course, this is going to be the respondents' perceptions. And so they can say that it's a priority. We don't necessarily we need to dig deeper. That's part two. But from what the respondents said, 31 folks, there were 5 different communities that had a youth plan of some kind. And then there were a little over 20% said they did not prioritize youth. So that was, or around 20%. So that was 6 respondents. That means that at least 80% of communities say that youth are a priority in some way. And we need to understand what that means, because if only 5 of them have community plans, and which are very clear ways to prioritize youth, then how do youth as a priority shake out in these other kind of contexts where maybe they're like one of many different priority populations? And this is all still a bit murky. So what we're going to do after this survey is going to move into doing some interviews with people that responded to the survey, and then also talking to doing some focus groups with young people and also with service providers in Ontario to kind of triangulate what are we experiencing as youth as a priority versus where do we want to be and how do we assert that more meaningfully? Which brings me to the conversation of engagement and how young people are engaged. So I asked specifically about whether they had lived expert advisories in general and then youth advisories specifically. And I mean, it's encouraging that we have, though there are only 39% said they had a lived expert advisory right now, another 13% were in the process of creating a lived expert advisory. We'd love to see those numbers go up, of course. But for youth, only 10% of communities or 3 respondents said they had a youth advisory, either for their overall strategy or for a youth plan. Now, they also noted different ways that young people or people in generally might be engaged. So whether that's the lived experience of staff or community advisory board members, community engagement practices that they engage in, like hosting meetings and consultations, or engagement through the service organizations that they partner with. But the challenge here is that frequently that's not really well documented. We don't know who is being represented in these conversations, what they said, how do we stay accountable to what was said, whose voices actually come through in these plans. That's not always clearly defined. It'll just be summarized in general community kind of engagement responses. So how do we get more specific and really understand what youth are saying and how to be accountable to that when we're doing this planning work? The other piece that I wanted to get into was the level of engagement. So I used the International Association of Public Participation's spectrum of engagement. I asked them about a whole bunch of different populations as well, not just youth. But when we look at the youth data, interestingly, a very, what we say, even distribution. So on either end, there are fewer folks that say that they did the kind of lightest touch engagement where you have just informing, you're giving young people information, versus on the other end of empower, you're actually engaging young people as co-decision makers with you. And then in the middle, most people answered that they were either in the consult category where they bring young people together on a specific date. It's usually like a one-off kind of thing. They might involve them through an advisory or something that's more has a few more occurrences of the same people, or they might collaborate with young people to make recommendations that they'll commit to putting into action. And then 7 of the respondents said they didn't explicitly engage youth. So there's a ton more to get into in the data, of course. And so this is just the highlights, and I'm going to, you're probably going to have tons of questions for me, but something I wanted to also make space for in this survey, I'm not going to read all of these out, but I might do a smattering. Just that survey participants, I asked them about the challenges of doing community homelessness planning work. And what I really got a felt sense of through their responses was the level of effort that people are putting in, and also the frustration of wanting to more deeply engage people. And specifically, they mentioned people with lived experience and wanting to meaningfully value their contributions and meaningfully reflect those in their planning efforts and their actions. And also the frustration of they take this time and energy and resources to create these community plans, and yet there's not a kind of flipping back of that information back up to the higher orders of government to say, so how are you showing up now that we've done this work? And specifically in Ontario, that's interesting because the province mandates these plans to be made, and yet where are they when the plans are made and the money is needed to then implement them? So lots of questions here to dig into that I'm really excited to talk to people about more deeply, to think about this accountability piece. And I think it should hopefully be validating. One of the fears that I may have had going into this research initially was are people going to feel just attacked and berated that I am being critical of community homelessness planning? I have some hope around it, it, but it is hard to look at all of this and go like, wow, we've done all this work for over 10 years and we're making new plans, new 10-year plans. Like, are we just doing the wrong work? And I want to say that I hope it's validating for both the folks that are in the room who may be engaged in their local planning processes or are trying to do the best they can, that it's not a you problem. It's not you as individuals, as workers, or as organizations, that there are these really systemic and structural issues that constrain the potential of this kind of planning work, which, having firsthand experience of doing this kind of planning, it's so hopeful when you're in the room. There's so much energy, there's so many creative ideas, and like people just show up and want to do the work. And yet there's these constraints that are put on. So how do we remove some of these constraints? Those are the things I want to dig into with folks in the next kind of phases of the research, and really try to figure out, are youth like just caught in the middle of all of this? At this current moment, it kind of seems that way. So in the next phases, I'm going to dig deeper into those questions of what does it mean to meaningfully prioritize and engage young people, given the current state of planning work in Ontario and across Canada? How do we ensure that young people's needs and priorities aren't lost in the shuffle of all of this complexity? And so to give you an idea of a bit of a roadmap of where I'm going with the research moving forward. So like I said, there's going to be some follow-up interviews and focus groups, working with a young lived expert as a research assistant who's going to support me with the focus groups with young people and with service providers. And once we finish this data collection phase, we're really excited to then bring the data back to folks like yourselves and with our community partners, such as Away Home Canada, the National Learning Community on Youth Homelessness, to think through the data and what is useful here. What do we find interesting and insightful, and what might we want to develop as knowledge outputs or like resources that could be useful not just to researchers, but to the community. We really want this to be a community engaged project. And then once we've developed those resources to have a bigger dialogue around community homelessness planning and its role and its potential for either, does it still have potential for advancing housing justice and for advancing the rights and the needs of young people? So that leads me to the end of the content of my presentation. I'm just going to say that like I said, you'll have way more questions for me than I have answers to, but I'm going to be jotting them down because they're important as I'm thinking through data analysis. And I'm also really curious about what you might want to learn from this project. And I want to encourage you to think about, maybe reflect on these questions. You might not have answers for them now, but maybe it'll spark some curiosity around what does it mean? Like, how do we begin to imagine alternative ways of planning that account for and are accountable to young people? So with that, I'll thank you. And like, please, I would love to hear from you if you're interested in this work, just following along or maybe participating in the next steps, especially folks in Ontario, like for now, but definitely spreading out on the horizon. And just to say, I appreciate all of you so much because this research came from you folks, the communities, and I'm really committed to giving something back through it and making sure that it helps us in our collective change efforts and our collective work for housing justice and justice more broadly. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda. Again, if anybody has some questions, we have the mic. We have a few minutes. I know that the sessions are running a little bit behind, but I can see some folks are scarpering. So please come and ask Amanda some questions.
Hello.
I would really like to just say I would love to have a conversation about what are the key barriers that I've faced in the city of Greater Sudbury, where we're running action research on chronic homelessness project, one of 8 sites across Canada, and our focus is on preventing Indigenous youth homelessness in transitions out of child welfare. So we're creating our upstream solution is to create an emerging adult services for empowerment network, a new coordinated access network to ease that transition into adulthood as they, learn to navigate adult services and as well as pursue goals and strength-based practices. But there have been tons of barriers, including navigating different community organizations, policies, and mandates, not only for protecting data, but also for how we share that data. And so would love to have a deeper chat about that.
Absolutely, would love to hear from you. And sorry, your name was?
Mandy Scott from City of Greater Sudbury.
Thank you.
Hello. I have a question. This is amazing because I think there's a lot of opportunity. Like if they're going to do the 10-year plan, we're sunsetting now on 2024. Maybe we think about the next 10 years. But I did want to pull the thread a little bit on the accountability piece. Like, what role do you see there being for advocacy amongst communities, municipalities, those relationships with the service providers, for trying to kind of have like a collective voice? Everybody's sort of saying like, how about we build in a mechanism to check in on this every couple years, or like, what about the young people? I would love to hear a little bit more about those types of opportunities to kind of, move toward a bit of change on that front.
For sure, yeah. And that's something I'm really excited to dig into with folks in the interview and focus group questions is like, what do those accountability mechanisms look like? Because we typically don't see them, or maybe there are some things that certain communities are doing but aren't well known. So yeah, I would love to dig into that more. Thank you.
Thanks for your work.
Hello.
I had to come up and ask a question because I asked everybody else. So
It's only
Amanda, I
fair.
can't let you go. The whole presentation, one of the things that was on my mind as a theme was the recruiting process and recruiting strategies of governments and anyone really when it comes to recruiting youth, lived experts of homelessness, because what I've noticed, and disclosure, before I became a professional, I was a lived expert, or I'm a living expert of youth homelessness and child welfare. And one of the themes that we quite often see is that in recruitment strategies and recruitment models that governments use, or even normal organizations, they usually recruit cream of the crop people. And so how do we diversify the pool of people who are being recruited to make sure that the people who are furthest away from these types of spaces to have their voices heard are actually being validated, identified, and invited, but also in terms of accessibility, how are you even doing that as a process, right? To make sure that you are reaching out to the people who are least likely to hear about these things, or least likely to hear about it through the mechanisms that you use as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. And interestingly, so my doctoral supervisor, Dr. Leah Levac at University of Guelph, we're doing another project on community advisory committees in general. And her research is looking specifically at that. Like, how do you get, like, if you say you want diversity, equity, and inclusion in those spaces, well, what are the practices you're using to engage with communities? So I think there'll be some overlap in that for sure. Thank you. Hi there.
Hi there. Yeah, this is all interesting information, and I'm glad that the youth are being thought of. My name's Terrence Bearchief from Treaty 7 Urban Indian Housing Authority in Calgary, Alberta, and Lethbridge, Alberta. But one of the things that I notice is with all these youth plans is what are the plans for the youth that come from the high needs community with living with autism and like getting further supports as they grow into adulthood?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Something that I think it would be interesting to think through as well, because there are some advocates for, do we create a specific youth homelessness strategy? How do we also maybe think about the other strategies that exist within a community? And are there some gaps where there's some overlap between the young people that are experiencing or are likely to end up in experiencing homelessness? And how do we think through, those complex needs before homelessness occurs, and taking that prevention lens and doing some maybe more cross-systems collaboration with folks that would be able to provide the support that young people with those needs have. I'd love to dig into that more and see what the communities that are in Ontario to start have said about how they think through that work. I'd love the questions. Thank you. Hi.
Oh, I don't like microphones. My name's Sarah. I'm at work at John Howard Society in Ottawa. My question is kind of more for all kind of studies together. So I work frontline. So what are your, yes, you do the studies and have the statistics, but what do you do after that? You have all this great information, but then how do we implement it into practice?
Anyone want to jump in?
That is such an important question, and what keeps me up at night as well, because one of the things, last month I got back from the European Conference on Homelessness, and I felt like a lot of my colleagues were a lot better at, trying to really influence public policy. And I came back kind of convicted and said to our team, we need to do a better job of that as well. I'm still sorting out like how do you do that? Because ultimately that's what needs to change, right? So like we can prove that, we've done 2 studies now where we've given portable rent subsidies and talked about that and how awesome it is. But, I don't think the government, because of our small study, implemented that. So I don't have an easy answer for you. I wish that I did. One thing that's really important for us is, we have these long-term community partners. So we don't just like drop in, do research and leave. And many times the young people, like we still have relationships with them. Not to excuse that we need to do a better job, but we don't just come in and leave. And then, some of the young people are now on our team, on our advisory board. But I think it's a really important question. And talk about accountability. I think as researchers, we all need to be held, be accountable as well. I don't know if you guys have anything else to say about that.
Sorry. I would just say something kind of along the same lines. I think that was a great answer. And it also is something that keeps me up at night. And I think many of us in this space. And my hope is that, I was an external researcher kind of looking at data that Making the Shift collected through their RCT. But my hope is that through research on Housing First for Youth and similar interventions that provide like rent subsidies and individualized supports, that there's advocacy for funding these types of programs on a more national level or on a greater scale so that, we're able to make actual differences. But similar to what you said, I know that the Making the Shift group, like a lot of the research assistants and caseworkers and people involved, they stay connected with the youth. And even reading on kind of my external level, just even reading through the interviews and their responses, you can tell the difference that the people who are directly interacting with them make in their lives in terms of helping them transition out of homelessness and navigate really that difficult transition and the transition to adulthood. So, but it's a really important comment and thank you for bringing that up.
We'll make this our last question.
Yeah, it's more of a comment, actually, kind of tacking into the question that was just asked. I think it's important when doing research with youth, and I do research with youth who are aging out of care. It's important to not just get statistics and data, but also to get their input in developing the solutions. So making recommendations, but like action-based recommendations. So like, here's how to actually implement the recommendation. So it doesn't just become a suggestion box to governments on what they maybe could be doing better. It's actually, no, here's the solution. We know them because we've lived through it. And I think when you provide that space in the studies that you're doing, it really solidifies kind of the data that you're finding because it's accompanied by really concrete solutions that are from the youth. So I think that's where the youth engagement piece can really come in and be meaningful. Thanks.
Thank you. And I heard you talk, I think it was last year in Vancouver. And it was a masterclass on how to do that. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I know we did run over time a little bit. Thank you to our presenters. It was so incredible to listen to all the work that's being done. As you know, this session is part of the youth stream. If you don't already know, there will be a full youth homelessness prevention conference in Toronto, February 24th to 26th, I believe, 2025. So there would be more information on our, is it prevention.ca website, I think, something like that. And you can register online. So thank you. Have a good afternoon.